Here's a little secret for y'all. I prefer Amphibia to the Owl House significantly. That's not to say the Owl House is bad. It is the more consistent show, and I have not been really disappointed by the Owl House, especially in Season 2. Its episodes are solid. But Amphibia, despite being less consistent, is much more compelling to me, and why this is the case. And I come back to arguments I've had with people in the fandom, or just times I've been shaking my head over a very ill-conceived Tumblr post regarding Sasha's motivations or Marcy's decision to not tell all of them the truth about her being the one to take them all to Amphibia. There are a lot of superficial misreadings of these three characters that give you a much less interesting show than the one we actually have, and completely fail to consider a lot of the desperation and the genuine attempts to try and make the world better on the parts of Sasha and Marcy, and as well as Anne's failings and flaws, her unwillingness to act the part of the good friend to Sasha and especially to Marcy. Now, I'm obviously not saying I like the show because I like the fandom, and I'm not saying I like the show because I like reading arguments from people who have not seriously considered Anne, Marcy, and Sasha, except in a very superficial way that is very Anne-centric. Now, what I'm saying is a little more complicated than that. I like that this is the kind of show where people can misread it if they're not being careful. Or just have a completely different reading from mine that's valid if you can back it up with evidence. It's the kind of show that can be read or misread in a lot of different ways. The Owl House is not really like that. The Owl House, compared to Amphibia, makes more clear what the show wants you to feel, and what it wants you to think about these characters. Now, there's obviously nothing wrong with that exactly, but it's those moments of ambiguity, of a particular perception about a character being shredded and dissolved into a lot of different perspectives on what a character wants or why a character is behaving the way they're behaving. All of that is much more interesting to me. The Owl House does have a few of these moments where there are no clear answers, no absolute ideas of what the show is trying to unambiguously convey. I love Ida's dream in Knock Knock Knocking on Hootie's Door, which is a very lyrical and graceful depiction of Ida's struggle with the owl beast. And I also quite love the ambitious choice they made at the end of Season 2A to have Luce make a promise to her mother to come back, even though that's a promise Luce is probably not going to be able to keep, nor does she have any real desire to keep it. The Luce situation in particular is worth looking at because there's not a clear person in the right and a person in the wrong. There's not a clear image of what the show wants you to think about Luce's decision. It doesn't necessarily want you to side with Luce or Camilla. Perhaps it's a little unfair that Camilla expects Luce to make such a promise, but could you really blame her, considering that she's in a situation where she feels like she's failed as a mother to her only daughter? And do you blame Luce for making that promise? Of course, she didn't want to, but she also wanted to leave her mother on good terms. I love moments like that, but still, as a whole, the narrative roles and perspectives of characters are not called into question nearly as much as they are in Amphibia. Luce, whatever flaw she might have, is still pretty clearly the hero, the one who's in the right. Whereas Anne, even though she has a good heart and she tries to do what's best, is not always a good and caring friend to Marcy and Sasha. She's rather impulsive, and she cannot always look outside her own perspective. All of this has made it possible for some people to suggest that Anne is going to move into a more antagonistic role in Season 3 relative to Marcy and Sasha, and relative to the general morality of the show. She's going to be in the wrong. This is a wild idea. I don't really think this is going to happen, but if it does, it would be more daring than even the Marcy storyline in Season 2. Now, the question, of course, is there evidence to support the idea that something like Anne taking on a more callous and dark role in the show is something that could happen? Well, actually, I think there is. Again, I do not think the show is going to take this route necessarily. At least I don't think it's going to take this route to the extent that it makes Anne an actual villain in Season 3, even a well-intentioned one. But I do believe that Anne is going to have her own values and the validity of her own moral perspective called into question in a way that was not necessarily the case in Season 1 or Season 2. This very well could happen. It's not guaranteed to happen, but I think it is a reasonable path one could expect Season 3 to traverse. And that such a path does seem plausible says a lot about how the show has characterized Anne. She is someone who is not a perfect friend. I would love to see the show frame her not as a victim who is always the one that absorbs suffering, necessarily. She is also someone who is capable of causing quite a bit of suffering. This doesn't mean she's a bad person, it's just that she's a 13-year-old who is very confident that she is in the right. She is very confident, perhaps overconfident, in how she has grown in Amphibia. She does not see how impulsive she can be. She does not see how she tends to only focus on her own immediate perspective and not really look at other people's ideas and values and perspectives and wonder if they might be in the right. The most glaring examples of this are when she is with Marcy in Newtopia. She spends a very small amount of time with Marcy. That should immediately strike people as odd. After taking all this time to get back to one of her best friends in the world, she mostly just leaves that best friend to basically do their group project, as Anne and Marcy put it, while Anne goes off and has fun. Marcy is there studying, she's doing serious research, Anne is just out there playing with the planters. Or look at A Day at the Aquarium, when Marcy very clearly wants Anne to stay with her, not because it's practical, but because she misses Anne. She wants to spend time with Anne. And Anne makes it very clear that she sees the idea of having to spend more time with Marcy instead of with the planters as a horrible fate that needs to be avoided at all costs. That hurts if you're Marcy, and Anne somehow does not see this. And this continues. Think about True Colors itself. When Marcy makes a comment about, don't you think it'd be great if we could stay here? And Anne just never considers that Marcy might actually be being serious, that Marcy might actually want to stay in Amphibia. And Anne is just always thinking about herself, so she's like, nah, it's great here, but I want to go back. And this is even the case in Anne's friendship with Sasha. A lot of people tend to view Anne uncritically in this friendship because Sasha has traits that one traditionally considers wrong or immoral. And to be sure, Sasha, especially in Season 1, is not the best at Anne. Sasha is controlling and manipulative, even if she's really not trying to be, and even though she has Anne's interests at heart, she is trying to get them home because she believes that's what Anne wants. But yeah, Sasha was often wrong in Season 1, so it was easier for a lot of people to just view Anne as being completely in the right, and then to carry that into Season 2, even though Anne, in regards to Sasha, is often wrong in Season 2. Anne really does not seem to care about her friendship with Sasha nearly as much as Sasha cares about her friendship with Anne. Anne reluctantly gives Sasha a second chance, which I suppose you can understand her reluctance, but she also continues to view Sasha very skeptically, just waiting for Sasha to mess up or do something wrong so Anne can claim the moral high ground and act like the noble and righteous one, as opposed to her immoral friend. But Anne is consistently wrong. She's wrong to side with the planters as they gang up on Sasha. She's wrong to view Sasha as being completely crazy and lacking decorum for reasonably objecting to the treatment she receives by the planters. And I'd even argue Anne's kind of in the wrong in Battle of the Bands, too. Obviously, one can very easily read Sasha's desire to change a lot of Anne's ideas as being another manifestation of Sasha's controlling character, but Sasha genuinely does believe she's doing what's right, and Anne, after coming to a sort of understanding with Sasha at the end of the dinner, I think should have at least tried to come to Sasha as an equal instead of just being very antagonistic toward her. And all of this really comes to a tragic culmination in True Colors. After Sasha makes her move to take the box, Anne is just so outraged that she rejects Sasha's attempt to send them home, even though that's what Anne wanted in the first place, and goes so far as to fight Sasha and try to seriously hurt her during their battle in Utopia, even though Sasha is really not fighting back and is just trying to get Anne to listen to the very real points that she has. The very real information she's trying to convey to Anne. When Anne believes she is in the right, she has a very hard time looking outside her own perspective. This is a problem. Now, of course, it is an inevitable problem to try and desperately understand the perspectives of other people. Their consciousnesses are inevitably beyond our grasp. I highly recommend Sartre's Being and Nothingness if you're into reading highly complicated 1,000-page books about philosophy regarding the problem of the self in regards to the other, We can only know the other as an object, not in the modern pejorative sense of objectification necessarily, but in the sense that we only know them as a part of our world, of our basic framework. We do not know them as subjects, as people who inevitably have their own world and their own perspective and their own viewpoints that contrast with ours, and in their world we are just an object, and they cannot fully comprehend our consciousnesses either. This is difficult. It's really hard to work around even if you're an experienced adult. And if you are a 13-year-old in a difficult position with your friends, it can be much harder. Still, Anne does not seem to value her friendships with Marcy and Sasha nearly as much as they value their friendships with Anne. Anne has the planters. She even calls Sprig her best friend in true colors when she's in the room with Marcy and Sasha, which on one hand is understandable, but if I were Marcy or Sasha, I'd feel kind of resentful at Anne there. I do think Anne is often in the wrong, and I do think she might have to confront her inability to look at the world from Marcy and Sasha's perspective and realize that Anne's idea of herself as the morally righteous one is not necessarily correct. I think that would be a much more fascinating personal conflict to run through Season 3, as opposed to just focusing on the big battle with Andreas, which I have to say I don't really care a lot about. I mean, nothing against Andreas, he's a fine villain, but I'm not really as invested in these big battles for the fate of the world nearly as much as I am in the friendship between these three people. Their desperation to really reassemble their relationship with the acknowledgement that they have very different perspectives and they have different desires for what they want in their lives, even in regards to Amphibia. This world has meant a lot of different things to the three of them. Their perspectives are not the same. So there is a very real chance that Anne could walk down a dark path as we progress. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. Keep watching Amphibia. What do you think are the odds that Anne's going to walk down a dark path? I'm not really sure myself. But hopefully it's something the show at least entertains. Anyway, tune in soon for our next analysis. It will be coming soon. That I can very much promise you. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.